Most people don't think of strategy that way.
Developing a new strategy.
Strategic blind spots.
When strategy meets reality.
Strategy and innovations.
In the strategy world.
Drive their strategic goals.
And welcome back to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. And welcome back to the Strategy Meets Reality. God, I can only speak today. Welcome back to the Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Alison Guthrie-Wrenn, and it's a pleasure that I've actually met you in person a few times before this episode. I don't normally get to meet people in person, so it's absolutely great to have you on. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here.
Cool. And just for our guests, could you give a bit of background about a bit of context about what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a senior civil servant and I've got a kind of, I guess, a day job that's quite busy. And particularly at the minute, as you can imagine, in government, it is very busy. There's a lot of stuff going on that we get involved in on behalf of the country and the government of the day. So that's always busy. I'm also now just starting to do some private practice. So I'm an endpoint assessor for the Systems Thinking Apprenticeship with a few different providers. And I do a little bit of kind of mentoring of students on the MSc Systems Thinking course at Exeter. So that keeps me kind of even more busy. But actually, it's super helpful because I learn from people as much as they learn from me, I think, in that kind of situation. So it's always really interesting to hear what other people are doing with their practice and then, being able to take lessons from that. So, it keeps me busy kind of doing stuff, but it also keeps my brain ticking, which is good because I think we all need that.
Exactly. And I think we can all get in that trap where we're stuck in one organisation or one system and then, create our own narratives.
Yeah.
And, what I think is great to have you on is because a lot of my guests, as the listeners will know, a lot of them are consultants or they are specialists. Their job is to advise organisations. And I've always been really wanting and interested to get people actually in organisations because we, I'm a consultant, have the privilege of looking outwards and giving advice and all that stuff. But it's different when you're in the system and especially when you're in government system, that is a highly constrained environment. So what may be seemed obvious for us to say and do, that's not really the reality that you face probably day in, day out, trying to navigate the different stakeholders and constraints that you face.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a highly constrained environment for lots of really good reasons. It's also a very highly complex environment. And I think some of that is visible from the outside, but actually a lot of it isn't. A lot of it's visible once you're within the system. So I think there's that kind of adds a different facet to the work that you do. And I think there's also something about kind of where you sit on the boundary of the problem, right? So as a consultant, you've got that kind of nice position of being outside the problem, trying to fix it from outside or help people to fix it from outside. And that feels very different to being inside the problem, trying to fix it from within, partly because of the constraints that you will be probably more aware of because you're within the system itself, but also partly because the relationships are there. The politics, internal politics, and all of that sort of stuff is a very real thing for you when you're internal. And I guess the way that you're perceived is really different. People perceive an external consultant very differently than someone who has a normal day job, but suddenly wants to dip into things that's like outside of their area, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, do you have the expertise to do this? And and it feels very different being inside to being outside. And I've done a bit of both, and they both have their benefits. I think the more difficult one is being inside, though, for me personally.
Yeah, I think so. Especially when you're, well, you know me, I'm not shy of saying what I think. And sometimes and I'm quite used to that privilege that I can get away with saying stuff. That probably people inside can't get away with, especially to whom as well. I think that power, especially in the sort of open up debate, looking at different perspectives is not as easy when you're trying to manage that sort of political, cultural, and also the power element.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think it is the kind of power dynamic is a bit different, and you have a sustained relationship within the organization that has to endure beyond the piece of work that you're doing. So there are limits to kind of the kinds of things that you would feel able to say and feel that you should say, as an internal. It does have that kind of different feel to it. And there's something about legitimacy in all of that as well, as an external. I think you are seen as having that legitimacy because you're an external, you've been called in to help to resolve a problem. So that gives you that legitimacy. As an internal, kind of pushing against some of those boundaries, that legitimacy, you may get that, but it's not a given. It hasn't been granted to you by virtue of the role that you have. Whereas as a consultant, largely it has. So there is a different kind of dynamic. Part of it's power, for sure. And I think part of it's kind of that enduring relationship thing. And part of it is the legitimacy that can be, I think, an issue.
And, correct me if I'm wrong, but I always view, the government as quite boundaried in the sense that you've got your different functions. So I was thinking with, especially with me, I can quite easily move between functions and the boundaries. And I don't fully understand what it is, but that legitimacy to move between boundaries, where I can imagine internally, if you're working in one function, like the, HR or operations or whatever different functions you have, that you trying to go in there, I bet you encounter a lot of defense because it's their boundary, their world. And what are you doing coming in to look at what I'm doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would say I've experienced defense, or not explicitly. Every profession has its own language and its own way of doing things, and that becomes implicitly a barrier and a defense. But I don't think that's necessarily a deliberate thing. But I think because it's partly, I think, because of the way that government is set up and the sheer size of the machine. We've got over 500,000 civil servants.
Wow.
It's a huge piece of machinery. And you've got to be able to segment that in some way. You've got to be able to do that because it's too big and unwieldy if you don't do that. And that segmenting over the, I was going to say tens of years. It's probably not tens of years. It's probably, a lot more than that, has led us to where we are now in terms of kind of departmental structures. So it's layered, I think. Boundaries are layered because you've got that kind of departmental setup where you've got X number of government departments. You've then got kind of arm's length bodies and all of that, partner organisations within that setup, some of them within that 500,000, some of them not. So it's very complex. And then you've got the boundaries in terms of role and profession. So we've got professions that are recognised across the civil service, and we've got lots of people who subscribe to those professions and who identify. I'm an HR professional. I always have been. I identify with the HR profession. So you are then further segmenting people down and the more you do that, the more risk you've got of siloing and not kind of reading across the boundaries. So we've got, it's not just that we've got boundaries, it's that we've got layers of boundaries. It's almost like tectonic plates. The boundaries kind of slide across each other, and it's a really, really complex picture. So to shift from one place to another is difficult, and we've all got, we've all got our own acronyms and our own language and our own IT kit and our own IT systems, and it's our own ways of doing things and budgets and headcounts, all of that stuff that we know kind of is the kind of the fabric of how government operates. Each department largely has its own way of doing that, and there are similarities, but there's enough difference to make it a bit tricky.
Yes, I think it's that difference that is crucial. And I was having this discussion with some clients yesterday around, they've got different areas. They're working in Asia, they've got Europe, all different areas, and they're going, well, we do things slightly different here, and we need to do things slightly here. And I said, well, that's the challenge, isn't it? I can't sit here and go, well, it's all simple. You can all have what you want, because we don't have the resources. And actually, some things have to be centralized. Some things can be decentralized. You know, we can't. Sometimes we may be able to accommodate difference, but a lot of the times we can't, because the more difference we create, the more complex it becomes. And then we've got to wonder if that complexity now becomes useful or harmful to us to be able to maintain viability.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And of course, when you're working in other parts of the world, then there's the cultural kind of implications of that can be really, really significant. And, you know, I've seen that in departments that I've worked in, where we do operate differently in different countries, because that is the norm in that country. And obviously that's what you want to try and do. You want to try and fit in with kind of how things are done in that part of the world. But it does become tricky. And I think kind of the civil service goes through cycles of this stuff about do we centralise or do we not? Do we have a dispersed model or do we have a centralised model for things? And normally kind of where you end up is in some kind of happy medium. Well, the problem is that kind of happy medium, there's always someone who's disappointed. there's always a bit of fallout when there's a happy medium. But, you know, in an organisation of that size, it's difficult to know what else you can do apart from reach compromises and try and kind of make sure that you are doing what is right for the majority of people within the system. And also for citizens, you know, because it in the civil service, you know, largely it's about delivering for citizens. It's about best use of taxpayers' money. Are we doing this in the most efficient way possible? And if not, then what does that shift start to look like? Do we need different processes? Do we need different kinds of people in different places? Fewer people, more people? It's constantly a shifting picture, really, in terms of delivering to the taxpayer.
Yeah, and it's got to, because external environment's changing, right? You know, what UK was 50 years ago is definitely not what it is today. So demand will change. That's quite interesting because you talk about, well, we mentioned that this is very complex as all this. So, and you're really keen on systems thinking, and you're trying to bring that into the civil service. And you think about all that complexity, where do you even start?
Well, I mean, you know, if I knew the answer to that, Mike, that's the $6 million question, isn't it? Where do you start? It's tricky. And I think you start with where you have influence and you start where you can with this stuff. You know, I mean, the civil service has a systems thinking interest group. We have quite a strong network of people who are interested in working more systemically in systemic practice. We've got a whole range of departments who are doing some work on that and who are kind of taking systems thinking and running with it. Co-chair a working group with externals to look at how we could best support government in doing some of that work and looking systemically kind of across the system about how do we help and how do we input where things are really difficult. But ultimately, I think you start where you personally can have the most impact. And so, I mean, that's certainly what I've done. You know, I've got involved in the community. I've run, masterclasses for all. So all senior civil servants now get the option of a systems thinking masterclass as part of their induction when they're new in their role as taking that first step up into senior leadership. We try and kind of talk to them about systems thinking and why it's helpful as a leader in this kind of huge system. And the take-up's really good for that, and it's really popular, but it is still a relatively small number of people compared to the population of the civil service. But it's that question about where do you start? And I think you start with where you can personally have influence, and that's where I can personally have influence. And I've gone in and kind of done work with various departments to support them and shown them kind of tools and methodologies and talk to them about this stuff. And it's something that I use a lot in my practice as a senior civil servant. I use this stuff a lot, but it's also something that I talk about a lot with other people and say, well, actually, here's a problem that we're trying to grapple with. Would a more kind of systemic view be helpful? Let's have a look at just broadening out a little bit and think about kind of where all the bits fit together. And so I use the kind of terminology and I use the thinking style a lot. And I quite often kind of talk to people about this stuff and do keynotes for conferences and all of that sort of stuff. And I end up always with the same phrase in my mind, which is, I am not always a systems practitioner. I am always a systems thinker. A systems thinker is what I am. It's the way that I think. Systems practice is different. That's something that I do. That's something that I have to take time out of the day job and go and really focus on and do. The thinking is different. The thinking is stuff that I can do all the time. And I think people do pick up on that, and they do see it. They do see that difference in the way that you would attack an issue and value it. You know, it is really valued across government, I think.
That's good. And, you know, there's a lot in there, and I love the thing around you are a system thinker in the way we think, which is good, but also could be a curse. I know for me, because I can get really frustrated when I see something. Why is that like that? Why? That doesn't make sense. My clients can tell because I start playing my hair like this when I start getting like, why? Yeah, I know the frustration's coming. What you said there is really, I think, a key thing when you're thinking about that sort of the strategy and the execution or the development of the organisation, and it's where you have influence and where you can, because I think that, you know, organisations can get themselves wrapped up so much in this perfect utopian, right, we've got this plan we're going to roll out, and it's got to be this perfect plan. We're going to get everyone in, and it's all going to work. And inevitably, those things don't stick. And I think just looking back and really thinking about, you know, where can we have that starting point?
Yeah, and I think so. There's a couple of things. I mean, we know that kind of big transformation programs on the whole don't achieve what they set out to achieve. And I think last time I looked, I think the stats, depends on whose research you read, but it's something between 70 and 90% failure rate, which is fairly horrific when you think of the kind of the money and the effort and the energy that goes into trying to transform anything, actually, but certainly, you know, when it comes to kind of public services and that kind of thing. So I think that is a problem, not just in my organisation or in the civil service, but actually for organisations as a whole. I don't think it's just a public sector thing. I think it's an organisational issue. So I think there is something about kind of setting the vision and having a really strong kind of vision and purpose about things. There's a quote that I often use that says, and I can't remember it verbatim, but it's something along the lines of, when it's turbulent, stick to the vision, not the plan. And I think there is something about that. There's something about, if your vision is to get from A to Z, then that's fine. And we have to have a really clear definition of what A is and also what Z is, and what it looks like and what it feels like, and, you know, what success would feel like to be at Z. What would that be? The B, C, D, E, E, etc. That's kind of up for debate, right? Because that depends on a whole range of different things. And certainly for us in the civil service, you know, the political cycles that we run on in this country mean that actually that plan has to be shiftable quite significantly, and sometimes really often, sometimes on quite a rapid kind of turnaround, because we work, the civil service is impartial and we work for the government of the day. So when the government of the day shifts and policies shift, then that can, you know, that really changes your plan sometimes. Actually, it sometimes really changes your vision, right? So if you move from one political party to another, that vision might look quite different. The difficulty for us, I guess, as a kind of government body or as a civil service, is that that becomes the job. Delivering that then becomes the job, and it might look really different to the job that you set out to deliver. So there's got to be fluidity in the plan always, I think, for every organisation. For us in the civil service, sometimes there's also fluidity in the vision, which is a bit more tricky to deal with. But we do, you know, I mean, we do it all the time. That is, you know, that is the nature of working in this kind of organisation. And it's no different to organisations that go through mergers and acquisitions, and, you know, that we all deal with stuff like that in our working lives. It's just probably more frequent for those of us in public sector, which makes that whole kind of try and stick to the vision, but the plan has to be fluid even more important, I think, probably for us.
Yeah. And I really like it because it's really important, the A and the Z. But I think a lot of people get too bogged down in the middle part and less so about the A and the Z. You know, where are we currently? Z's like, you know, when the smoke clears, what's meaningfully going to be different? We seem to be looser on those and more tighter in the middle, where we need to be tighter on the ends and looser in the middle. And
yeah, it's kind of what difference will it make? You know, if we get to Z, what difference will it make, and to what? You know, will it just make us feel better as an organisation? And is that what we want to achieve? Will it make outcomes for citizens better? And is that what we need to achieve? Clearly, it depends on the work. But having that really clear kind of the kind of North Star, really, that you are aiming for. This is what we're trying to do, and this is why we're trying to do it. And this is broadly how we're going to do it. The plan, that's going to shift underneath there.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, you know, we get very focused in all organisations, and I've worked in the private sector as well. I spent 10 years in the private sector before I joined the public sector. And every organisation does this. We kind of focus on the project plan, the RAG rating, the bits of the plan. So we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and at some point we're going to do this. What we tend not to focus on as much is the interconnections between them. So what success factors do we need in order to then progress to B? And have we fulfilled them before we've progressed to B? And do they still hold water? Are they still the right success measures? Or actually, has the world around us shifted, and do we need to just shift a little bit? And it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it is about being adaptive and kind of having that fluid and flexible kind of strategic design principle that underpins everything. Because there's no point going through a whole kind of strategic plan for 12 months or whatever it was you set it out to be, only to realise that you've not achieved what you set out to achieve, because the world looks entirely different to the way it did when you first set off on the journey. That's the most frustrating thing in the world.
Yeah. And I think people get so focused on the minutiae stuff that they forget to look outside. And I always say there's really two crucial feedback. Like, one is I call it the effect loop, which is all this activity that we're doing is the total effect of that having the strategic effect that we're trying to go for, achieve the outcome. And the other one is I call it the intent feedback, that, you know, is our strategy still relevant given what's changing in the external environment? And it's just constantly thinking about those things, I think, is really crucial. And I've worked across, you know, public, private, but it's really interesting in this sort of public space. I worked across NHS and Network Rail and stuff, and things do change. And I think teams get so focused on what's changing, and they forget that what's not changing. And it's just like really focus on, because I work with some teams and I'm like, yeah, that's changing. The things changing, but what you fundamentally exist for is not changing. You're here to, you know, do this or to maintain the asset or that. So let's focus on what's not changing, and then let's see how those constraints that have now been put in are now going to mean that your plan is going to have to adapt slightly or quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's getting the balance right, I guess, isn't it? It's always the same with this stuff. There's always a balance. There's a balance and a tension between what's staying the same and what's changing, and how do we make people as autonomous as possible and able to deal with all of those slings and arrows, but we got to know what they're all doing, and we don't want rogue operators. So, you know, we have to have that cohesion kind of tension there as well. It's all about managing those tensions, I think.
Yes.
In the way that we set our organisations up, but also in the way that we kind of structure the work that we do. And it's just sometimes, I think, just reminding people of that there is always a balance, and sometimes it'll tip more one way than another. Sometimes you'll have a lot of stuff changing and not a lot staying the same. There's always something.
Yeah.
And sometimes it'll tip the other way. And we're very kind of static, almost in stasis, really. And not a lot is shifting. And there are benefits and downsides to all of that, isn't there? You know, I mean, if you are in that position, it feels very comfortable, but actually, where's your creativity? Where's your innovation? What are you driving the organisation towards if you are kind of not changing a lot. So some of it is striking the balance and kind of talking to people about that. And some of it's about framing it in that way, I think. And certainly from a kind of people perspective, helping people to see the benefits of both sides of that coin, because there are definitely benefits to working in both kind of sets of scenarios, I think.
Yeah. And there's something that really interests me, actually, because I've talked a lot about that bit where we're talking about the fluidity that is required when, how we get there starts to change. But you mentioned something earlier about when Z changes and the different, you get a new political government in and that changes shifts or something like that. Now that's something different because, we're still achieving the aims here, but that's how we get there. I can sort of deal with that. But how have you found that people cope when fundamentally the direction changes completely?
I think that's probably one of the most difficult things in working in this kind of environment, because I think for a lot of people, we spend a long time at work, and there are many thousands of public servants who kind of pour their heart and soul into the work that they do, and they're deeply invested in it and deeply believe that what they're doing is absolutely the right thing and is for the public good, and all of that sentiment, which is absolutely fabulous that we have that in our public services. So when that happens, and when we see a complete shift, I mean, there's always kind of minor shifts, I think, and we kind of deal with that. But when there's a really big shift, I think that's really hard to deal with. And we have seen that, in recent times. We've changed governments. Everybody knows that. And there are shifts in policy. Of course there are. And I think it's one of the most tricky things to deal with, because you have invested your time and your energy into pursuing something. And I think the way that we tend to do it, certainly from my perspective, the way that I tend to deal with it, and I think a lot of kind of public servants tend to deal with it, is to reframe it a bit, and to think about, our role is to invest our time and energy in supporting the government of the day. It's not about personal agenda. We are intrinsically kind of apolitical in our stance. That is part of being in the civil service. So I think it's about pouring your energy into, is this what the government of the day was asking for? Yes. And did I do that to the best of my ability? Yes, I did. That has now shifted. This is now what we need to be focusing on, and I need to put the energy into that instead. But of course, that's difficult, when you've done a job for 10 years and you've gone in a certain direction. To shift that overnight, it is tricky.
Yes.
But people work in the public service kind of arena and they get that. They understand that is part of the job. You are there to support the government of the day. That's where you put your energy. I had a very similar conversation with kind of senior colleagues a few weeks ago now about policy, kind of what our role is in supporting the kind of the development of government policy, and how we can kind of make sure that we give the best advice possible. And we were talking about kind of exploring some of the things we've talked about, exploring boundaries of problems and, looking at potential different solutions to things. And it's one of the things that cropped up about, we have to frame it as our job is to give the best advice to the government who happens to be in power at that time. And, that may or may not chime with personal belief, but that is what the job is. And that is what we deliver.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial I think that's why we can't understate the importance of role and positioning and perspective in these situations, because as soon as they become a bit murky, that's where you definitely in your environment, and I take my hat off to you, especially with in civil servants, because especially now with, it's no secret that our political views are becoming more and more polarized, and that means that challenge is going to become more and more of a challenge for you. But I think having that sort of clarity of role, clarity of perspective, I think is crucial to help guide that. And I think it really underlines the nature of organisations and strategy, that it's just imperfect. And
Yeah.
you know, we just deliver the fact that things are imperfect, and we're not going for the best option. Often we're scrapping for the least worst option, and that's what's going to get us through. And you know, we have to make some very, very difficult choices that are going to not appease people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in your
No, I
world,
think-
you're not going to appease, you know, everyone by any
No.
stretch of the imagination.
No, but no, well, no, and I think in life, you know, in general, you can't please all the people all of the time. In fact, sometimes you can't please any of the people all of the time, you know. But that's life, you know. That is kind of, we all know that. But I think that's right, Mike. I think it's kind of, we don't live in a perfect world, and therefore any solutions that we reach are not going to be perfect solutions. They're going to be the best that we can do at that given moment in time. And when things shift, then the solution should be capable of shifting with it. I think that's the key thing.
Yes.
It's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about finding a solution that is adaptive when circumstances change, because they will undoubtedly change, sometimes really rapidly, and sometimes, you know, 3 or 4 times in the space of as many months, or, you know, even shorter sometimes. So it's, you know, it's not about finding the perfect solution, because I don't think that exists. I think we'd be looking for a very long time if we searched for that. It's finding the best fit for that moment in time that creates the most benefit and the least damage, and is shiftable, I think.
Yeah. And that's that thing, isn't it? It's like, you know, if we take this decision, will it still give us options?
Yeah.
And I think that's the crucial thing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I think, you know, that's important that we kind of, where we can, we maintain those options, because quite often we need them. You know, when you any kind of strategic work, you know, you need to have kind of exit routes for when things change, because they do. So yeah, no, I think that's right.
Yeah. Definitely with the increased volatility that we face with our international partners, anything can change. Anything's up for negotiation, and I think that's what people forget nowadays. Is like, yeah, the world always has been complex. Things have always been complex and stuff, but I think at the moment, I think it's the rate of that change.
Yeah.
And the uncertainty of that, because we could deal before, we knew things were changing, but we could pretty much make reasonable assumptions around what may emerge. But I think nowadays it's just, we're unsure. Multiple things can emerge, and multiple things can emerge at the same time. So that ability to have those options, or to consider those options, is crucial.
Yeah. I heard something recently about our ability to kind of accurately forecast and predict. And I think it was something around, I think the most we can ever kind of accurately predict, and there's a lot of controversy about whether this is too long, is 400 days. That's not a lot.
No.
It's really not a
That's
lot.
not. No.
You know, when you're looking at national policy and, you know, all of that sort of stuff, that's not a long time.
No.
Which kind of puts our 3-year plans and our 5-year plans into perhaps a little bit of doubt. But yeah, I mean, you know, we can't predict. The world is becoming more turbulent, more polarized. The assumptions we could have potentially made previously, we probably can't now, or certainly not to the degree that we're used to. So you're right. It's not just that we're getting more complex, because I think we are, but it's the nature of that complexity, and it's the volatility, I think, for me, and therefore the consequences of that change. The consequences feel bigger now than perhaps they did previously. It's becoming a more high stakes game, I think.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a perfect storm of it's becoming more politically charged and more high stakes, and it's more turbulent and polarized, and our ability to forecast accurately is diminishing by the minute. I think all of that combined makes it really difficult to operate as an organization in that environment.
Yeah, I really agree. And it's like, it sort of brings to challenge our sort of normal operating mode, especially with the high volatility, but we're still obsessed with efficiency. And I get why we are, because obviously, especially in your world, because, you know, you're spending finite money, the taxpayers' money, so you've got to show that you're efficient. But also, we still need the capacity to be able to deal with this uncertainty. And the high stakes part, I often look at it and I think about this, and I think there's more, and it's, you definitely see it amplified in the political stream, is that you don't want to be that leader that commits to something. Because as soon as you commit to something, you can be proven wrong. And as soon as you're proven wrong, everyone's out there going, "Oh, they need to be fired. They need fired. They need an election now." And so I think it drives that sort of cloak of ambiguity that if I'm just the more vague I am, the more elusive I am, then, you know, less I can be held accountable for those decisions. But it doesn't really help when you're thinking to everybody else where they just need a bit of solid direction that they can then adapt to.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficult thing is that we kind of hold people to account by the courts of public opinion a lot of the time. And that, you know, I guess that goes through a lot of different worlds, you know, politics included. But I think we do it across the board, actually. We've become more populist and more kind of, trial by Twitter, which isn't the most objective way to make any kind of judgment, I would suggest. And it's problematic. It's problematic, you know, in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different people, I think, in, you know, in life in general. And it's part of it is that polarizing thing. You know, we've become more polarized and everybody has a view. And of course, online communities and that kind of thing mean that people aren't worried about sharing that view because they can do so anonymously. You know, don't have to put their head above the parapet. They can quite easily say whatever they think and it not be attributable back to them necessarily. And that, you know, in some ways that's a good thing because it means that everyone's on a level playing field and everyone can have a say. But actually, you see a lot of damage done in the name of that. It is problematic. And we make snap judgments, I think, because of that, not knowing the full facts, I would suggest. Yeah. The full facts are often very different to what is presented on Twitter or in the media, or, you know, and we know that through history. It's always been that way. You can't believe everything you read in the press. Well, we can't, but increasingly we really can't because there's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of AI produced stuff that you can't actually tell the difference between what's real and what's not, and that muddies the waters. So it's all murky and problematic, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's rise of populism. Again, it's furthers that point we were talking about with boundaries, isn't it? That, you know, social media and communications is great with amplifying those boundaries because I will only see that perspective. And from this perspective, anything else is going to be wrong unless I'm willing to open up this perspective and see it from a different angle.
Yeah.
I don't need to now because I'm just getting fed what I want to hear.
No, of course. And of course, feeds are tailored to our viewing habits. So the more you read, the more you are fed that kind of information and viewpoint, and you don't open up the viewpoint. I mean, so I guess it's one of the reasons why the whole kind of systems thinking world is, I think, interesting to me, but also highly valuable to me because there is such an emphasis on worldview and on having different worldviews in the mix. And I think that's absolutely critical, you know, beyond any shadow of a doubt, you know, having different voices around the table when you're making whatever kind of decision, actually, but certainly the big kind of chunky decisions that we deal with in government is just absolutely crucial. So that, you know, that's one of the things that kind of drew me into the kind of systems thinking world, that emphasis on diversity and voice and knowing that you've kind of heard a breadth of view, which we don't tend to hear in kind of everyday life necessarily anymore.
No. And it's like what John Boyd talks about, that incestuous amplification, that, you know, if we just have that closed view, we're only hearing our own narratives. Where what I really love is that question from critical systems heuristics, where it's like, who is not present but should have a voice? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Great,
think just
great
I've been
question.
asking that question. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
it's something that I think leaders should always sort of think about when they're not going to get all the voices, but at least they've thought about who has not had the voice that should do, and how could we meaningfully include that in there for our decisions? Because it's their perspective. They can see, is it going to be them that's impacted by the decisions?
Yeah, and how do we account for the marginalised? Because actually, the marginalised potentially are the people who will be impacted the most if we make the wrong choices and the wrong decisions. So it's how do we make sure that they are at least represented? Tricky. I mean, always tricky to do, but absolutely brilliant question.
Yeah, and there's always going to be, with every decision, there's always going to be unintended consequences of how it meets reality. And we're like, wow, okay, all we're trying to do by that question is just minimize that surprise.
Yeah.
As much as possible.
Yeah.
It's been, I really enjoy this. And I think a key thing that you're probably finding is this sort of timing. Because I had a question yesterday about, how far should we look out for our strategy, what time frame? And I think there was a wanting for me to say, oh no, yeah, 18 months, 3 years, 5 years, and they got, because I'm a psychologist, the obvious answer was it depends. And I was like, it does depend. It depends on so much stuff, like how fast is the external environment moving, how quick can you, what's your rate of change relative to that? All these things come in. It could be how quick it actually takes to do something in the external environment. Actually, we could do something that we thought would be 3 years, but actually we do something and it opens up opportunities. We can do that in 18 months. I think we sort of need to move away from this temporal thing of that has to be 5 years, 10 years, and actually keep it to more a consistent view of an orientation of what's happening. I'm saying that as privilege. That must be probably quite a challenge in your organisation.
It is, and I think it is because, and I don't think we're unlike other organisations in this respect. I think we make public commitments to things because we have to make public commitments to things. Government, it would be a sorry government who never made any public commitment to do anything ever. That's not how government works, is it?
No, yeah, exactly.
And of course, the civil service has to deliver on that. Is our job to support ministers in doing that. So it's a lot of that is kind of driven by that agenda, and how quickly or slowly do we think we need to deliver on this particular piece of work, because actually that's a political commitment that's been made and that's what we're here to do. We're here to deliver that. So that is difficult. And I think it kind of goes back in a bit of a loop probably to what we were talking about earlier about having that vision and kind of what is the purpose of this piece of work, and therefore kind of where are we trying to get to, what's our Z and what's our A, and then having that fluidity underneath it that says, that, and some of that might be temporal, some of it might be, for the first 6 months we're going to go great guns and we're going to speed it up and we're going to get to a point, and then we're going to reassess, and then we might go a bit slower because X, Y, and Z is happening and we know that's happening. It's that kind of fluidity in terms of kind of how we get to Z, but also how quickly or how slowly we might choose to do that. So I think having that kind of flex in the delivery plan is important. The Z probably is prescribed, and a timeline ultimately for Z may well be prescribed. But how we get to that is perhaps a little bit more in our gift.
Yeah. And I think the reason I raise that question is purely exactly what you stated, is the expectation of the commitments. And I think that's where the challenge really comes in, because you are, like most organisations, but I think really spotlighted for civil service or the government, is that you are expected to make those commitments and deliver on those commitments, and even if things change. And that, I think that's where it becomes a really tough sort of environment to working.
Yeah. And I think also the fact that those commitments are things that everybody in this country is invested in and takes an interest in. Not all of them, but, largely, we deal with really difficult problems that affect all of society. X organization probably doesn't get that scrutiny and people aren't as interested. Are they going to deliver widgets A and B or A, B, C and D? Well, either, don't really mind. Is the government going to tackle some of the big issues of the day, poverty and knife crime and immigration and, all of the really big kind of topics that people talk about? Well, everyone has a view on that and everyone's interested in it. So there's a commitment there politically and for the civil service that, these are the things we're focusing on, quite rightly, and that shifts over time and, all the rest of it. But they are things that everyone will scrutinise and everyone will take an interest in. So the delivery of that becomes much more heavily scrutinised.
Yeah, I agree. It's been absolutely fascinating having you on. Just before I let you go and to crack on saving our great country, is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners to think about from this episode?
I think the one thing that I would say, and we've covered it really, is this thing about start where you can, start where you've got influence, and where there's a crack, and where you can kind of work your way into that crack and make a difference, a positive difference. I think that a lot of people, want to get involved in this kind of work and have these kinds of conversations and are reticent to do that because they can't see where it will have an impact and they can't see something that's big enough and meaty enough for them to get their hands on. And I particularly come across this with new practitioners. So new practitioners are kind of, well, I need to do a big piece of work. And my advice to them quite often is you don't need to do a big piece of work. You need to do an impactful piece of work. That's different. And it might be quite small and it might be something that's in your gift, but it will have a big impact. And I think I would say that probably to everyone, start where you can have an influence and an impact, even if it's quite small, because things can then grow from there.
Thank you so much for being such a great guest. I think there's a lot of value there from our conversation. I think not just focused on civil service, but actually it's transferable to all organisations and even individuals. So for the listeners, if you enjoyed this, please like, share and subscribe so people can get the value from Alison's work. And I'll put Alison's details of her LinkedIn, not a government email address because she doesn't be hassled by policy things.
No, we'll do that.
But absolutely love this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Alison.
Been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
And I hope to see you again soon.
Yes, you too.
Take care, everyone.
Cheers.